Hey there, everyone. Today I would like to talk about textuality as it applies to Finnegans Wake. And more specifically, I want to sort of analyze and deconstruct this idea of context. Because when we're trying to come to the meaning of a text, we often are forced to look to its context. And the question becomes, how far does that context go? Does that just apply to the immediately surrounding signifiers within a sentence? Is it the surrounding sentences, the surrounding paragraphs? Is it the whole of the book? Does it extend to the historical context in which the book was written, or the historical context in which the reader engages with the book? So there are a wide variety of implications of this idea of context. And Derrida has some really interesting things to say about text and context that I want to use here to kind of weave this larger textual fabric, this sort of generalized textuality that I think James Joyce is trying to craft in Finnegans Wake. Because Finnegans Wake is one of those literary edge cases that really challenges what it means to interpret a text and to interpret it well. What does it mean to come to a proper or a correct or a plausible reading? Oftentimes one can see, for example, if one is especially debating like a holy text, like the Bible or the Quran, the question becomes, oh, you have to take this verse in context, right? Because if you take it out of context, you might misunderstand that, oh, this is God proclaiming something, or this is a prophet saying something, but which God will later go on to punish them for, and that context will kind of change whether or not we should be assenting to their actions or words. But the idea of context really gets strained in Finnegans Wake, because Finnegans Wake is, yes, it's one book, but it is a polyvocal and heterogeneous book, artificially unified into a singular literary artifact that thereby sets its own bounds at itself at the same time that it is really working from the inside to efface that selfhood, right? It is one text insofar as it is 628 pages bound together by a common spine. And yet, if anyone does any research into Finnegans Wake, you'll find that it is a series of tales, narratives, vignettes that are sort of loosely collated into this common project. But it really is more articulated by the difference amongst its signifiers and the relations formed between different signifiers, the sort of generalized differentiation, as Deleuze would put it, right? This is an attitude and an action of differentiation that does not apply from one discourse relative to another, but it is an internal differentiation within a discourse that causes it to be different from itself. And this is what Finnegans Wake does. So when we really try to pin down what is Finnegans Wake, where does it take place? Who is, the dreamer or the narrator or the main characters? You sort of are at a loss of words because everything is internally divided by a brisure, as Derrida would put it, a fissure or a fracture, right? And Finnegans Wake is really interesting because we really have to think about this idea that Derrida takes from Saussure, which is that language is a system of differential marks, that each signifier only signifies insofar as it establishes a differential relationship relative to other signifiers. So, for example, bat is a meaningful word insofar as it can be meaningfully differentiated from cat and mat and sat, right? So you have some phonological differences that can be generalized according to certain linguistic rules, and that can be used to give you a definite relationship of different signifiers to each other and the fact that they are different from one another. And Saussure, as well as Derrida, tries to show that language is a system of negativities, that it does not have some originary positive presence. All it has is this differential relationship, such that it is a meaningful system relative to its own system of differences. And what this means is that signifiers are always going to be hearkening to each other in various ways. And Finnegans Wake is really interesting because it uses a logic of what I would call distant hearkening. Right? Think about when you hearken to someone in the distance and you can't exactly see them. They're not exactly in focus, and yet you prefer some hearkening to them. And in so doing, you aim to effectuate a future state of affairs with really the promise, the guarantee that it is not going to be completely set out in accordance with the way you would like it to be, right? You're going to have to do some negotiation along the lines as things sort of come into view, as things come into focus and they become more clear, and you elaborate your units along the way. And in Finnegans Wake, these hearkenings truly are not differentiated by their location within the book, right? So context is not defined by something that is immediately close spatially in the environs or vicinity of a particular signifier. Something can be illuminated distantly by a hearkening that comes 600 pages away in Finnegans Wake. Therefore, the context of any passage is defined and delimited to the book level, not the nearby sentence level. So the book as a whole is a generalized textual fabric in which we can find any one point potentially hearkening to any other point. And none of these hearkenings are pre-established in the text. They are established as the reader comes to the text and they start to connect different things and say that, oh, this is a plausible connection to this. Because I mentioned earlier, this idea of the proper or the plausible reading really comes into question, such that we really don't have these categories before they begin to be negotiated and formalized and theorized in the context of our literary criticism, in the context of coming to the book and trying to come to formal systematic readings of the book. And of course, Finnegans Wake systematically challenges this systematicity. Therefore, any one passage can highlight any other, being graftable into common context and made to communicate a co-meaning. And this idea of grafting contexts is something that Derrida actually says is a precondition for signs, and it shows the primacy of what he calls arche-writing. That is a primary writing as a system of différence that precedes speech. That before the speech and the malapropisms and all the failures and negotiations that go along with speech, we have this possibility for inscription beyond the speaker's intent, right? Beyond the intentionalistic cognitive goings-on of any one speaker. Writing is basically this idea that signifiers can be divorced from that context, and that in fact, far from being the constraining context in which the signifier can signify, beyond that being the exclusive place where it can signify, writing can be grafted out of any context and put in a new one and made to signify in a new way. Derrida calls this citational grafting. And this basically means that context is something malleable, just as the text is something malleable. Because just as we negotiate the text on the whole as we're going through the reading, when it comes to specifically looking at a passage and trying to figure out what does this mean, you look at anything that appears to be spoken and a number of questions come up. Who is speaking this? Where are they speaking this? Who are they speaking this to? Why are they speaking this? What is the meaning of what they speak? What imagery does it use? Is it a metaphor? All these other rhetorical questions of exactly on what register and in what manner does this utterance function? And how do we know that it is an utterance in the first place? And there are, of course, many other classes of linguistic acts beyond utterances. But when we're looking at any one of them and using utterances here as an example, the question becomes, what exactly counts as the constraining, qualifying context of this utterance that makes it make sense? That means that it is, for example, a question or a proposition or some sort of rhetorical question or a retort. All of these are slightly different, and these are made in accordance with certain rules that Joyce basically loosens, because he makes it such that the conventions concerning language are no longer absolute. And one of the many ways that he does this is with inverted commas, that is, quotation marks. Joyce is infamous for not liking and not using quotation marks. And this is part of his stream of consciousness technique that he develops in Ulysses, for example, where the differences between some external action and an internal state of consciousness are blurred, because this is in fact how we experience life. It's not exactly clear what is the difference between something that is just coming from out there and something just coming from in here. These are both equiprimordially molded into one common fabric that we are negotiating as we live our lives and try to figure out, what does the world mean? What is the meaning of existence? What is the meaning of my life? Etc. As such, motifs in Finnegans Wake are established hundreds of pages apart, right? They're establishing lines of cross-continuity that are interwoven through the book's fabric. And these are going to slip and slide under one another. As Lacan says, the signifier slips under the signified and basically bypasses it supposedly having a determinate locus that it refers to, something in the world. No, in fact, the signifier takes on a slippery motion where it basically bypasses its own finality and leads into, sequentially, a chain of future signifiers. And thus you get this generalized, iterable textuality. The textual warp and weave acts in concert such that its internal differentiation creates a generalized text semantics. Right? So what something means must be evaluated on the level of the text as a whole. And this does not mean that we are trying to reduce the text to one common meaning. In fact, this is the great problem and also the great release that we get when we come to Finnegans Wake, is when we try to enact this generalized text semantics, when we approach the work and try to figure out what it means, we find that it is far from univocal, right? As I said earlier, it is heterogeneous, it is polyvocal, it is internally fraught with brisures, such that we cannot reduce it to any one system or any one theory. The whole book is like one giant suspended sentence, and in fact, the suspended sentence is a phrase that is used in Finnegans Wake in chapter 1.5. It is a textual semantic deferral, preventing the generalizability of any one meaning, that is, a reading, or a scheme or framework of meaning, that is, a theory or a discourse. So a particular reading of any passage is deferred, as well as a generalizable, reducible scheme by which we approach the text. That is also something which is deferred, because we're always trying to use more frameworks. We're always trying to use new historicism or deconstruction or psycholinguistics or philology or go down the list. There are all sorts of paradigms of theory and literary study that are used in the course of Wake criticism to try to piece apart this book, and it always seems like we need more. This prevents the text from being reduced to what Heidegger would call something which is zu Handenheit, ready to hand, something which is used in the mode of a tool. It is its bare material facticity, and it either serves a function or it doesn't. This determinate role doesn't really work for Finnegans Wake. It is more than its material facticity, its imperiality, its empiricity. Instead, it is kept as a liminal virtual register that is historically articulated and ensures an inadequacy that basically ensures an always supplemental register which we are creating in the act of interpretation. And it always demands new readings. This book is therefore a revolt against the static and a valorization of dynamic, ineffable excess. Jonathan Culler in On Deconstruction has some really helpful remarks on context that relate to Derridian thought and just French theory more broadly that I think will be really helpful for kind of elucidating what I'm trying to say. He has this phrase that he coins: meaning is context bound, but context is boundless. And he explains it as following. Meaning is context bound, right? Meaning can only be determined by those differential relations to other things in the context that would help elucidate its function. So intensions do not in fact suffice to determine meaning, right? The signifiers don't require being bolstered and buttressed by a conscious subject's intention to be able to signify something. Therefore, context must be mobilized. That is, textual relativity must be invoked in order to explain the function of these signifiers. But context is boundless, so accounts of context never provide full determinations of meaning. That is, if we try to find the determinate function of everything in the context, and the real question is, what counts as the context? What counts as the immediate context, furthermore? What is really seen as constraining or determining or delimiting the meaning of a particular signifying unit or an individual signifier? Against any set of formulations, one can imagine further possibilities of context, including the expansion of context produced by the reinscription within a context of the description of it. That is, we can continue to iterate this signifier in new contexts merely by reformulating and readdressing the questions of context that we use to contextualize any piece of signification. What if, Derrida suggests, the meaning of meaning is infinite implication, the unchecked referral from signifier to signifier? If its force is a certain pure and infinite equivocalness, which gives signified meaning no respite, no rest, but engages it within its own economy to go on signifying and to differ, that is, to differ and to defer. This is really interesting, this idea of general equivocation, right? Where you have polysemy and polyvocality allowed to slip and slide together and allowed to bump past each other without their movement being arrested, precisely because equivocation can always be continued. We can always recontextualize, always re-equivocate by putting things in new confluence with one another. And as a result, we get this textual web that never stops moving, and yet it still demands that we approach it and read it. I think this is a really fascinating way to approach Finnegans Wake. I think it's entirely appropriate, in fact necessary, to come up with the readings that are sensitive enough, because Finnegans Wake demands a great deal of exacting sensitivity. It also demands a uniquely jocular care and frivolity that I think people are all too unwilling to give it, to allow its play to speak forth. But hopefully some of these ideas about context will really challenge you to do that in your own readings of Finnegans Wake, as well as other books, but especially for Finnegans Wake. So that being said, that's it for this lecture. I hope it's been somewhat helpful. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because it really helps me be able to purchase the books necessary to bring y'all content, but no pressure, care about yourself first. That being said, that's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.